The sun was a malevolent eye in the sky, glaring down on the city with merciless heat. Asphalt shimmered like water, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the intensity. It was the kind of day that made you want to stay indoors, preferably submerged in a tub of ice water. But life, as it often did, had other plans. For Amara, life's plan was simple: soda. A craving, sharp and insistent as the heat, had taken hold, demanding a sugary, ice-cold remedy. She'd been cooped up all day, her left arm encased in a bulky, bright blue cast, a souvenir from a clumsy basketball game, the memory of which felt as distant as winter, slipping on her sneakers, the laces a vibrant clash against the faded denim of her shorts. Amara ignored the slight throb in her healing bone. It was a dull ache, more annoyance than pain now. She was 12, fiercely independent, and not about to let a broken arm or the oppressive heat dictate her day. The corner store, Miller's Mart, wasn't far, just a few blocks down, a familiar beacon of fluorescent light and air conditioning in the simmering neighborhood. As she stepped out, the heat hit her like a physical force. It was a living, breathing thing, thick and suffocating. Even the shadows seemed to offer little respite, merely pockets of slightly less intense heat. She shielded her eyes with her good hand, the cast a cumbersome weight at her side, and started her walk. Each step on the scorching pavement sent waves of heat radiating upwards. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of hot tar and exhaust fumes, a typical city summer cocktail. Miller's Mart was a small, independent grocery, a neighborhood staple. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything you needed, and Mrs. Davis, the cashier, always had a kind smile and a piece of candy for the kids. Amara liked it there. It felt safe, familiar, a small island of normalcy in the sometimes chaotic rhythm of the city. Pushing open the glass door, she was immediately enveloped in a wave of blessed coolness. The air conditioning hummed a low, comforting drone, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence outside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a bright, almost clinical glow on the aisles of neatly stacked shelves. The familiar scent of floor cleaner and slightly stale popcorn hung in the air, a comforting aroma that was uniquely Miller's Mart. As Amara made her way to the refrigerated drink section at the back, she noticed two men entering, their presence instantly shifting the atmosphere. They were large, imposing figures, even in the brightly lit store. One was bald, with muscles that strained against his simple t-shirt, and a smile that seemed more performative than genuine. The other, even bigger, with a playful glint in his eyes and a disarming charm, exuded a quiet confidence. There was something undeniably familiar about them, a star quality that even their casual clothes couldn't hide, but Amara was too focused on her quest for soda to place it. They moved with an easy camaraderie, their laughter echoing softly in the otherwise quiet store. They were clearly coming from a workout. Beads of sweat still glistened on their foreheads. "Man, I needed that air conditioning," the bald one chuckled, rolling his shoulders with a satisfied sigh. His voice was deep, resonant, instantly recognizable even if Amara couldn't quite grasp why. "Tell me about it," the other replied, heading straight for the refrigerators, his gaze fixed on the promise of icy refreshment. "Let's grab something cold before we melt." They were heading in the same direction as Amara, but she didn't pay them much mind. She was laser-focused on the colorful array of soda bottles, her eyes scanning for her favorite brand, the one with the bright red label and the promise of sugary, fizzy bliss. She reached the fridge, her hand hovering over the chilled glass door, when a different kind of movement caught her eye. Down the aisle, near the jewelry counter, a small glass case displaying cheap necklaces and bracelets, a figure moved, with a furtive quickness. It was a man, tall and bulky, clad in a black leather jacket that seemed ridiculously out of place in the sweltering heat. His bald head gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting a cold, hard edge. His arms were thick, heavily tattooed, and his eyes darted around nervously, a predator checking for witnesses. He was holding something small, glittering in his hand. A golden bracelet, catching the light, sparkling with what looked like embedded diamonds. Amara watched, a flicker of unease prickling her senses. She saw him quickly glance around again, then, with a practiced swiftness, he slipped the bracelet under his jacket, his movements too quick, too practiced to be innocent. He started to move towards the exit, his steps deliberate, almost too casual. Something snapped in Amara. It wasn't bravery, not exactly. It was more like a sudden surge of indignation, a fierce, instinctive rejection of injustice. It was wrong, plain and simple. He was stealing, in broad daylight, in her neighborhood store, and no one was doing anything. Mrs. Davis behind the counter was engrossed in a magazine, oblivious. The two large men were still browsing the drinks, their backs turned. In that moment, something ignited within Amara. It was a spark of defiance, a refusal to be a passive bystander. She might be small, she might have a broken arm, but she had a voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out from behind the drinks fridge, her voice clear and surprisingly steady as it cut through the hum of the air conditioning. "Sir," she called out, her voice carrying a surprising amount of authority for a 12-year-old. "Put that back." The word hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. The bald man in the leather jacket froze mid-stride, his back stiffening like a startled animal. Amara felt a tremor of nerves, a tiny voice whispering caution in the back of her mind. But it was quickly overridden by the surge of righteous anger that propelled her forward. Behind her, she heard a rustle of movement. The two larger men, the ones heading for the drinks, had stopped. She could feel their attention shift, their presence suddenly looming behind her, though she didn't dare turn around. Her focus was locked on the biker, his posture radiating a simmering menace. He slowly turned, his head swiveling like a turret, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on Amara. His expression was a mask of disbelief, then annoyance, finally hardening into something ugly, something predatory. His lips curled into a sneer that revealed yellowed teeth. "What did you just say, you little brat?" His voice was low, gravelly, laced with a threat that resonated deep in Amara's chest. It was the kind of voice that could make grown men flinch, but Amara stood her ground, her feet planted firmly on the cool tile floor. "You tried to steal that," she repeated, her voice unwavering, though she could feel her heart starting to hammer against her ribs. "I saw you put it under your jacket and head for the exit." She pointed a finger, encased in its blue cast, towards the spot where he had been standing, near the jewelry counter. The gesture felt small, almost pathetic against his hulking frame, but she refused to back down. The air in the aisle seemed to thicken, the hum of the air conditioning suddenly louder, more intrusive. A few customers previously browsing oblivious to the unfolding drama started to notice. Heads turned, eyes widened, whispers began to ripple through the store. Mrs. Davis, finally noticing the shift in atmosphere, peered over her magazine, her brow furrowed with concern. Near the snack aisle, a man with a receding hairline and a polo shirt discreetly pulled out his phone, the small red light of the recording indicator blinking to life. The biker's face twisted, his sneer deepening into a snarl. "Oh, so now you're the law." He took a step towards Amara, his movements heavy, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "Listen here, you little—" He searched for an insult, his eyes raking over her small frame, her cast, her defiant stance. He took another threatening step forward, and Amara instinctively recoiled, taking a small step back. But before he could close the distance, before his menacing shadow could fully engulf her, a powerful voice boomed from behind, her cutting through the tension like a thunderclap. "Hey pal, problem here?" Amara jumped, startled, and finally turned her head. The two large men from the entrance were now standing directly behind her, flanking her like silent guardians. The bald one, the one with the deep voice, had stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow over Amara. His eyes, previously warm and amused, were now hard, focused, fixed on the biker. Beside him, the other man stood equally tall, his expression unreadable, but radiating an aura of quiet power that was even more intimidating. The biker's face shifted again, surprise momentarily eclipsing his anger. He glanced from Amara to the two men, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly as recognition dawned. He seemed to recognize them, to understand, in an instant, that the situation had drastically shifted. He let out a harsh, forced laugh, the sound grating and unnatural. "You know I was going to buy this," he said, his voice suddenly smoother, almost reasonable, though the underlying menace still lingered. He reached under his jacket and pulled out the golden bracelet, dangling it between his thick fingers. Just admiring it, you know. He tried to force a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. They remained cold, calculating, assessing the new threat. He was trying to backpedal, to salvage the situation, but the shift in his demeanor felt too abrupt, too unconvincing. He crouched down slightly, bringing his face closer to Amara's, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "But now," he continued, his breath hot and stale on her face, "I'm thinking I should teach you some respect first." His eyes narrowed, focusing on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You think you can run that mouth just 'cause someone let you into this store? Newsflash, kid. You ain't got the right to talk to me like that." Amara didn't flinch. Despite the fear that was now a cold knot in her stomach, she held his gaze, her chin lifted in defiance. "You stole it," she repeated, her voice still steady, still clear. The simple accusation hung between them, undeniable, unwavering. The biker's nostrils flared, his patience finally snapping. He raised his hand, thick and calloused, his fingers curling into a fist. Amara braced herself, her eyes closing instinctively, expecting the blow, the pain. But it never came. Instead, there was a sudden, explosive sound, a muffled grunt, and the feeling of a powerful force erupting beside her. She opened her eyes, blinking rapidly, disoriented. The biker was no longer in front of her. He was sprawling on the tile floor, his body twisted at an awkward angle, his face contorted in pain and shock. Standing over him, his fist clenched, his jaw tight with barely contained fury, was the bald man, John Cena. Amara's mind finally caught up, the pieces clicking into place. She recognized them now. John Cena and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, movie stars, wrestlers, real-life heroes somehow, impossibly, standing in Miller's Mart, defending her. "You serious?" Cena growled, his voice a low rumble of barely suppressed rage. "Trying to hit a kid?" The biker scrambled back, pushing himself up onto his elbows, his eyes wide with disbelief and fury. He looked from Cena to Amara, then back to Cena, his face flushing crimson. "The hell do you think you're doing, punk?" he snarled, his voice thick with venom. Before he could even attempt to get to his feet, Dwayne Johnson stepped forward, moving with a fluid grace that belied his massive size. He positioned himself beside Cena, his towering presence alone enough to intimidate most people. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes like chips of ice. "Walk away," Dwayne said, his voice low, dangerous, resonating with an authority that brooked no argument. "Before you regret it." The biker's eyes darted around the store, taking in the scene. The onlookers frozen in place, the cashier's wide-eyed terror, the man still filming discreetly from the snack aisle, and, most importantly, the two imposing figures standing between him and his intended target. He saw the cameras, the witnesses, the sheer impossibility of winning this confrontation. His bravado faltered, his anger momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of self-preservation. He knew he was outmatched, outmaneuvered, and, perhaps for the first time that day, out of control. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening and loosening in frustration. "Damn right I was going to buy it," he spat, the words laced with forced indignation. He tossed the golden bracelet onto the counter with a clatter, the cheap metal ringing against the laminate surface. He turned back to Amara, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. "This ain't over, you little—" He couldn't even bring himself to finish the insult, his rage choking the words in his throat. Before he could say anything more, Cena's hand shot out, grabbing the biker by the front of his leather jacket. The biker's feet scrabbled for purchase as Cena hauled him upright, his grip like iron. With a grunt of exertion, Cena shoved him towards the exit, propelling him forward with surprising force. "Get lost," Cena growled, his voice low and menacing. Just then, as if summoned by the rising tension, two figures in dark blue uniforms rushed into the store, their eyes scanning the scene with practiced efficiency. Security. Miller's Mart security, finally arriving, alerted by the commotion. They stepped in, their presence immediately diffusing the immediate threat. The biker, already reeling from Cena's intervention, stumbled backward, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of authority. He muttered curses under his breath, his swagger completely evaporated. As he was practically propelled towards the doors by the security guards, he turned back one last time, his gaze locking onto Amara, his eyes narrowed slits of pure malice. "We'll meet again," he snarled, the words a whispered promise of future violence. Amara didn't even blink. She met his hateful stare with a steady, unwavering gaze, her small frame radiating a surprising resilience. She wouldn't be intimidated, not anymore. As soon as the biker disappeared through the automatic doors, the tension in the store seemed to dissipate, like a storm suddenly passing. The customers who had been frozen in place started to murmur, their hushed whispers filling the air. A few brave souls ventured closer, offering words of praise to Cena and Dwayne, their voices filled with awe and gratitude. Amara let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline starting to recede, leaving behind a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She turned towards her unlikely saviors, a small, hesitant smile forming on her face. "Thanks," she said, the word barely audible, but sincere. Dwayne knelt slightly, bringing himself down to her eye level, his gaze gentle, concerned. "You okay?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Yeah," she replied, her voice gaining a little more strength. "I've had worse." It was a bravado-laced statement, but beneath it, Dwayne could see a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the fear she had just faced. Cena looked at her cast, his brow furrowed in concern. "That how you got that?" he asked, gesturing towards her blue appendage. "Oh, this?" Amara grinned, the smile now widening, genuine. "Nah." She shook her head, the cast bobbing slightly. "I broke it playing basketball. Slipped, fell, landed wrong, but it doesn't hurt anymore." She shrugged it off, dismissing the injury as if it were nothing. Dwayne raised an impressed eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Tough kid," he murmured, admiring her resilience. Cena smirked, a flash of his signature grin. "I like that." Mrs. Davis, the cashier, finally spoke up, clearing her throat nervously. Thank you," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly. I should have done something sooner." Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of shame and relief. Cena waved it off dismissively. "It's handled," he said, his tone reassuring. Dwayne glanced down at Amara again, his gaze thoughtful. "You need someone to walk you home?" he offered, his voice gentle. She shook her head, a touch of her earlier independence returning. "I live close," she said, pointing vaguely in the direction of the exit. "I just wanted a soda. It's crazy hot out today." Cena chuckled, a warm, genuine sound. "Genuine. That's why we came in too," he said, mirroring her earlier craving. Amara gave them a small nod, a gesture of gratitude and acceptance. Then, remembering her original mission, she grabbed a bottle of cold soda from the fridge, the condensation, cool against her skin. She turned back to them one last time, a spark of admiration in her eyes. "You guys are cool," she said, the words simple, heartfelt. Then, with a newfound confidence in her stride, she headed towards the checkout, leaving Cena and Dwayne standing together, watching her go. But something about the biker's last words, his whispered threat, lingered in Cena's mind, a shadow in the otherwise bright relief of the moment. Dwayne noticed his expression, the subtle shift in his demeanor, and sighed. "You think he's stupid enough to actually try something again?" he asked, his voice low. Cena exhaled slowly through his nose, his gaze still fixed on the spot where Amara had just been standing. "Guys like that," he said, his voice quiet, thoughtful. "They don't let things go." Dwayne's expression hardened, the playful glint in his eyes replaced by a steely resolve. "They might not have been done with him," he echoed, the unspoken implication hanging heavy in the air. And for Amara, the simple trip for a soda had just taken a dangerous and unexpected turn. Amara stepped out of Miller's Mart, the bottle of cold soda clutched in her good hand, the air outside hitting her like a furnace blast once more. But the oppressive heat felt almost welcome. It was a familiar discomfort, a known quantity, a stark contrast to the unsettling tension that had just gripped the store. The air outside was hot, yes, but it was also clean, open, free. The tension from the store, the lingering threat of the biker, started to dissipate with each step she took. She knew she had done the right thing. That biker had tried to steal, and she, Amara, had called him out. Simple as that. And then, unbelievably, Cena and Dwayne Johnson had stepped in. It still felt surreal, like something out of a movie, not real life. Her house wasn't far, just a 10-minute walk, a route she knew intimately, past a few quiet intersections, a small park bathed in the afternoon sun, and then home. She had walked this path countless times in every kind of weather, at every time of day. And despite what had just happened, despite the biker's menacing words, she wasn't scared. Not really. She had stood up to him, and he had been handled, kicked out like the trash he was. The thought brought a small, defiant smile to her lips. As she walked, she twisted the cap off her soda and took a long, satisfying gulp. The icy liquid slid down her throat, a welcome balm against the lingering dryness. The sugary sweetness was exactly what she needed, a tangible reward for her afternoon's adventure. The streets were quiet, almost deserted in the afternoon heat. The occasional car rumbled past, a distant lawnmower whirred somewhere in the distance, the mundane sounds of suburbia. She turned a corner, the familiar houses of her street coming into view, each one a silent sentinel in the afternoon sun. Her sneakers made soft scuffing noises against the pavement, the only sound accompanying her thoughts. But as she walked, a strange feeling crept into her chest. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was more like unease, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the empty sidewalk behind her. Nothing. Just the sun-drenched pavement, the silent houses, the shimmering heat haze distorting the view. A couple of houses down, an older man in a straw hat was watering his lawn, his movements slow and deliberate, completely unaware of anything out of the ordinary. A dog barked distantly, somewhere further down the street. Everything seemed normal, peaceful. She shook off the feeling, attributing it to lingering tension from the incident in the store. She was probably just jumpy, her nerves still frayed, from the confrontation. It was understandable. But then, a low, distant rumbling caught her attention. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, like a soft hum in the background, the sound of an engine. It wasn't loud, not yet, more like a soft vibration in the air. But something about it made her uneasy. It was a deeper, more resonant sound than a car engine, a distinct, throaty growl. She quickened her pace, her steps, becoming more hurried. Her house was only a few blocks away now, just past the park at the end of the street. She could almost see it, the familiar blue paint of her front door, the welcoming shade of the old oak tree in her front yard. The engine. Noise grew louder, closer, the hum escalating into a distinct rhythmic rumble. Amara's grip on her soda bottle tightened, her knuckles whitening. She glanced back again, her heart now starting to beat faster, a nervous flutter in her chest. Rounding the corner behind her, cruising slowly, almost casually, was a motorcycle, black, gleaming, menacing even at a distance. The rider wore a black helmet, his face completely obscured, an anonymous, faceless figure. Her heartbeat sped up, adrenaline starting to pump through her veins. But she forced herself to stay calm, to breathe, to rationalize. It could be anyone. People rode motorcycles all the time. It was a city, after all. Then, a second bike appeared, behind the first, mirroring its movements, its rider equally anonymous, equally clad in black. And then a third, and a fourth, all black, all silent, all moving with the same slow, deliberate pace. A cold chill ran down her spine, a wave of icy, dread washing over her. They weren't speeding towards her, not yet. But their slow, deliberate pace, their silent, menacing presence, sent a clear, unmistakable message. They were following her. She swallowed hard, the soda suddenly tasting like ash in her mouth. She turned forward, her legs moving faster now, almost a jog. She was close. Just past the park, and she would be home. She forced herself not to run, not to panic. Running would only make it worse, would signal her fear, would embolden them. The motorcycles didn't pass her. They stayed behind. A dark, ominous escort, matching her pace. Their engines a low, menacing growl that vibrated in the air around her. Her breath quickened, coming in shallow gasps. She reached the edge of the park, the familiar green space, a sudden stark contrast to the concrete and asphalt of the street. Her house, her sanctuary, was just down the next street. She was almost there. And then 4 figures stepped out from behind the thick trees lining the park's edge. Shadows detached themselves from the shade, solidifying into human forms. Amara froze, her feet rooted to the pavement, her breath caught in her throat. The men stood in the grass, blocking her path, an impenetrable wall of leather and menace. Leather jackets, heavy boots, familiar sneers twisting their faces. And at the front, staring directly at her, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred, was him. The biker from the store. The one she had thought was gone. The one she had thought was defeated. He was back, and he hadn't come alone. Amara's stomach dropped, plummeting like a stone in icy water. She had been so focused on the motorcycles behind her, on the mechanical threat, that she had completely missed the human ambush waiting ahead. It was a classic pincer movement, a calculated trap. They had her surrounded. The biker grinned, a slow, cruel stretch of his lips, cracking his knuckles with a sickening pop. "Told you we'd meet again, didn't I?" he said, his voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. Her mind screamed at her to run, to turn back, to find another way, any way out of this. But her feet refused to move, frozen in place, paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming wave of fear. The engines behind her rumbled louder, the motorcycles now stationary, forming a dark semicircle behind her. The riders were dismounting, their movements slow, deliberate, adding to the suffocating sense of encirclement. She was trapped. The biker took a step closer, his shadow falling over her, engulfing her in a chilling darkness. "Not so tough now, huh?" he sneered, his eyes raking over her small, vulnerable frame, her fists clenched instinctively, her nails digging into her palms. She wouldn't beg, she wouldn't cry, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "You brought friends," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor that ran through her body. "What, too scared to face me alone?" The words were defiant, laced with a sarcasm she didn't quite feel, but needed to project. The other bikers chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. One of them, a lanky man with a jagged scar slashing across his cheek, smirked. "This little brat's got a mouth on her." Another, stocky and broad-shouldered, cracked his neck, the sound sharp and ominous in the quiet street. "Maybe we should help her shut it." Amara's pulse pounded in her ears, a frantic drumbeat of fear. But she kept her face blank, her expression carefully neutral, masking the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. The leader's smile turned sharp, predatory. "See, I don't like being embarrassed, kid," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "And you embarrassed me real bad today." Amara took a slow step back, her eyes darting around, searching for any possible escape route, any glimmer of hope. "Oh no, don't run," the biker warned, wagging a thick finger at her. "We just want to have a little talk." She didn't believe that for a second. Her house was right there, just beyond the park, just a few steps away. If she could just break past them. Suddenly, the leader lunged forward, his hand snaking out, grabbing her injured arm, his fingers squeezing brutally over the cast. A sharp, searing pain shot through her arm, radiating outwards like fire. She screamed, an involuntary cry of agony, ripped from her throat. "Where's that attitude now?" he growled, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and foul. Amara gasped, blinking back the hot sting of tears, refusing to let them see her cry, even as the pain became almost unbearable. "Let me go," she gritted out, her voice strained, choked with pain. He twisted her arm slightly, the pressure intensifying, making her whimper. "Oh, I don't think so," he said, his voice laced with cruel amusement. "See, I like watching you squirm." The other bikers laughed, a chorus of ugly mocking sounds, and then a voice boomed across the park, shattering the tense silence. A voice like thunder, like the voice of justice itself. "Hey, scumbags!" The bikers whirled around, startled, their predatory focus broken. Standing at the edge of the sidewalk, their towering figures unmistakable, were Cena and Dwayne Johnson. Cena took a step forward, rolling his broad shoulders, his fists already clenched, his expression a thundercloud of righteous anger. Dwayne's face was pure fury, his eyes blazing with an intensity that could melt steel. "4 grown men against 1 little girl," Cena said, his voice low, dangerous, resonating with righteous indignation. "Guess that makes you the toughest guys in town." Amara sagged in relief, the pain in her arm momentarily forgotten, a wave of hope washing over her. The leader's grip loosened, his cocky smirk faltering, replaced by a flicker of apprehension. "This ain't your business, big guy," he muttered, trying to regain his bravado. Dwayne tilted his head, his gaze unwavering, his voice cold as ice. "Oh, but it is." The scarred biker spat on the ground, his bravado returning, fueled by desperation. "What, you two think you can take all of us?" Cena let out a slow, amused breath, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Then, the smile widened, becoming a full-fledged smirk, confident, terrifyingly assured. "That's exactly what we think." The stocky biker pulled out a chain, wrapping it around his knuckles, the metal glinting ominously in the fading light. Another reached into his pocket, flipping open a switchblade, the sharp click echoing in the quiet air. The leader sneered, his fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of desperate aggression. "You're outnumbered." Dwayne cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp and decisive. "You sure about that?" Amara, clutching her aching arm, took a step back, creating a little space, a silent prayer forming on her lips. The air went still, charged with a palpable tension, the calm before the storm. Then, with a guttural roar, the bikers charged. But they had underestimated their opponents. They had underestimated the fury of men protecting the innocent. They had underestimated the power of justice, delivered with lightning-fast reflexes and devastating force. In less than a minute, it was over. The bikers were on the ground, groaning, defeated, their threats silenced by the swift, decisive action of 2 men who knew how to fight and knew why they were fighting. As police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, Cena turned to Amara, his brow furrowed with concern. "You okay?" She nodded, cradling her injured arm, but standing tall, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and awe. "Yeah," she said, her voice stronger now, filled with a newfound strength. "I think so." Dwayne rolled his shoulders, stepping over the unconscious biker at his feet, his expression almost bored. That was almost too easy. But the leader, still coughing from the brutal slam Cena had delivered, suddenly let out a low chuckle, a gurgling, painful sound. He wiped blood from his lip, his grin twisted, defiant, even in defeat. "You idiots think this is over?" He wheezed, his eyes glinting with a dangerous, unyielding hatred. Cena narrowed his eyes, his gaze hardening. "You still want more?" But the answer came not from the biker, but from the approaching wail of sirens, the flashing blue and red lights, filling the night, painting the park in a chaotic, pulsating glow. Police cruisers skidded into the park, tires screeching, neighbors emerging from their houses drawn by the commotion. Justice, in the form of flashing lights and uniformed officers, had finally arrived. And this time, it was truly over. Justice had been served. And Amara, the brave girl who dared to speak up, had learned the true meaning of strength, not in power or size, but in courage and conviction. The night finally was calm once more.